My thoughts on the Atonement. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. And as always, thank you for tuning in. So we have noticed in the comments, a number of folks have asked for my thoughts on the atonement. That is, if you're unfamiliar with that term, what is it that the crucifixion of Christ actually accomplishes on behalf of humanity, the centerpiece of the Christian faith, the Christian religion? What does it actually do? And I think in particular, and here I'm guessing because just based on context, that a lot of folks are probably familiar with one particular understanding that maybe they've heard, from Protestants, or maybe they grew up as Protestants, maybe they are Protestants, I don't know. But they've heard one particular understanding of the significance of the cross of Christ and his crucifixion and what it does, what it accomplishes. And they've probably noticed that I don't really talk about it that way. And I've gone through this Eastern patristic narrative, from time to time, talking about the meta-narrative of the Eastern Church Fathers and things like our series on the problem of evil. And that sort of picture that they have an understanding of, the thing they heard about what the Christian gospel is, according to the sort of Protestant characterization that they might be familiar with, it doesn't sound like what I'm talking about. And so there's probably a curiosity to say, well, what are your thoughts on that? Is there a difference? What's the difference? And so on. And so that's what we're going to do today. I'm gonna try to address that question. Now, I think maybe the best place to begin is to just talk about how the average person who has exposure to Christianity largely in a Western context, largely in a Western Protestant contemporary context, how they understand the significance of the crucifixion. And this goes to one of the things that I've talked about in the past, which is that I've characterized the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West, if I were to really just sort of boil it down in a very simplified way. What I would tend to do is say, well, in the Latin West, there is a tendency to think of the Christian religion as primarily a legal religion, where God is a lawgiver. Our primary problem as human beings, the centerpiece of the human condition, is that we are lawbreakers, and at some point we're going to face future judgment, and that's a predicament. And here, the crucifixion of Christ, in some ways, gets us off the hook. And I've contrasted that with perhaps what you could call a more therapeutic view in the Christian East, where the Christian gospel, the Christian religion, is largely much more about life and death, and the idea that humanity is made for a certain partaking and participation in the life of God. And when we retreat from that, we retreat into an unnatural state of death and dying and corruption, and that the Christian religion is entirely about trying to remedy that, heal that, and bring us back to what we are ultimately made to be. So I've drawn that contrast, and I think that contrast is a helpful contrast when you're talking about, well, let's look at how most the average sort of Protestant, at least, would think about the cross of Christ and the Christian gospel. As I said, it's primarily set up in terms of a judicial problem, that God is a judge. You are somebody who has violated his laws. You're going to stand before the judge at some point, and you will inevitably be condemned because you've violated his laws. And you see this all the time on sort of a popular level with regard to sort of Protestant tracts. If you've ever seen these little booklets that are handed out, or Protestant presentations of the gospel, or things like that. And there's all sorts of analogies that tend to come up in this popular sort of colloquial version of it, in order to say that Jesus died for your sins. And what that usually means in this Protestant context, the Protestant gospel, is to say that you are going to be punished, and Jesus steps in order to take your punishment, right? Like, that's the sort of basics of it. And so you hear any number of metaphors for this, right? You'll hear about, the judge decides that, he condemns you, that you're guilty, but then he takes off his robes and he goes and offers himself to take your punishment instead, right? Something like that. I've even heard, like, This one actually made me cringe a little bit, but I even heard somebody tell a story about how like they had two sons and, one had done something wrong and the dad was going to spank the son. And so the one who was innocent, was like, hey, let me take his spanking instead. And being a good dad, I couldn't not spank somebody. I'm not sure why that was a premise, but that was the premise. And so I spanked the innocent son instead of the guilty one, and the innocent one took the punishment, and the guilty one got off scot-free. And that's kind of how the understanding of the crucifixion plays out or is presented within a sort of contemporary Protestant context. The idea that what's happening is that somehow all of the sins of humanity, all of the due punishment for things done wrong is being poured out on Jesus. And essentially, God the Father is punishing Jesus on behalf of humanity so that he doesn't have to punish you and I. And like I said, that's sort of the very sort of simplified version of this. Now, there's a few different developments where this comes from in the history of the Latin West. What you start to see is you see this emerge largely with Anselm and his Cur Deus Homo, right? Why the God man, right? Why God, or sometimes it's translated, why did God become man? But why the God man? And within that, what you start to see is you see Anselm try to build a case that builds this logic for why Christ needs to be both God and humanity. And this is where you start to see this rationale that suggests that what's important is that if Christ is going to, in some ways, take the punishment for man, then he has to actually be a man, because the punishment is due to the human species, to the human race, to humans. And yet, at the same time, if humanity were somehow delivered from their condition by someone, let's say by an angel, if that were possible, that an angel could rescue us from our damnation, then we would be rightly debtors to that angel. But man is ultimately made to be a debtor to God. And for this reason, it's important that whoever delivers us from our condemnation is ultimately also divine, because at the end of the day, the redeemed humanity needs to be ultimately devoted to God. And so this is where you get Anselm's rationale for suggesting that what needs to happen is you need an incarnation where you have God rescue humanity, and how he rescues humanity is by becoming man. And then by becoming man, he's in a position in order to take the punishment of man on man's behalf. And so that's like the Anselmian version is where you're starting to get the sort of the groundwork for that way of thinking and arguing and interpreting the atonement. In medieval thought, this gets really sort of fleshed out in a variety of ways. But one of the things that you start to see in people like Catherine of Siena, for example, is there really is this insistence that what's happening is that the wrath of God toward humanity ends up being poured out on Christ. I think it's in one of Catherine's writings where she talks about Christ offering up his body like an anvil to God the Father, so that he can take the hammer of his wrath and like beat it out, on the back of Christ. I think that's if I'm remembering correctly, that's the metaphor that she ultimately uses. And then you also get, later in Protestantism, you start to get this becomes a very popular view of atonement, and for reasons I'll come back to. But since we're just talking about developments, you see this sort of thing in Jonathan Edwards, for example, where what he'll talk about the idea that what humanity is due is infinite punishment. Now, again, this is one of these premises that a lot of people would bristle at. Why would a single sin merit an eternal torment in the fires of hell or something like that? And Edwards' answer is largely that the punishment due is based on the sort of the value or the goodness of the thing sinned against, and since God is of infinite value, therefore the punishment needs to be infinite, and so for that reason, man is due infinite punishment. And so if somebody's going to step in and take that punishment, that person who's going to step in not only has to be a suitable substitute, right? This being the Anselmian point about humanity, but also has to be capable of absorbing, infinite punishment. And so this is where Edwards suggests that Christ, being both God and man, is important because being human, he's able to take humanity's punishment, but being God, he's able to absorb the infinite in a finite period of time. And that's what happens on the cross. On the cross, he absorbs this infinite punishment of humanity on behalf of humanity. And basically, that's where you see that sort of thinking going on, right? That's how this sort of thought develops over time, and with this, this sort of centrality of that to Protestantism is largely due to the ways in which the Protestant Reformation itself was sparked and the disputes over the Christian gospel. So just by way of context, in order to frame this, and I've talked about this like in the Connectly episode that we did, where I commented on the exchange between an Orthodox fellow and the Connectleys about orthodoxy. You can see that episode for a more thorough treatment of some of the differences, between East and West on things like grace and works and merits and things like that than what I'm going to talk about here. But just by way of a quick background that provides context for why this view of the atonement became so important to the Protestant mind, let's just talk briefly about how this concept of merits and demerits and transferred merits ultimately begins to develop in the Latin West, which sets the stage for the importance of this particular theory of atonement within the Protestant context. So again, by way of background, Augustine of Hippo is somebody who begins to introduce this doctrine of the order of loves, which becomes central to a lot of Western Latin thinking. So Augustine had talked about, he'd recognized that whenever you and I engage in some sort of act, we do so out of certain love or affection, right? The thing that we've encountered, we identify as in some way good, and that good, we have a certain love or an affection for it. And yet Augustine recognized that we can't have all the goods that we desire at one time, right? The good of being a monk is different than the good of being married. You've got to pick which one are you going to be, and we encounter this all the time. We wake up, we think we should work out, it would be good for us, but we also really enjoy sleeping in and we like the ease of that. And those are both goods, but they're in conflict. So we've got to pick. And when we pick, what Augustine suggests is there is a certain priority of loves that choice reflects. Certain things are elevated above other things. Other things are subordinated. And so what Augustine suggests is he suggests that the order of the loves that we have, the orders of the loves that sit behind an act, are ultimately what determine whether or not an act is meritorious before God or demeritorious before God. Now, why is that? Just acknowledging here, like merits and demerits was something that exists in the Latin West. You can find it in writers before Augustine, like people like Ambrose. But what you see in Augustine is starting to ask the question, a question about justice, right? That when we're talking about, like, say, this righteousness or justice that comes from God, talked about in like Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, what does it mean, right? Like, what does it mean to be just, right? What does it mean to be righteous? And here, the assumption, of course, that Augustine has is that the just or the righteous man has merit before God, whereas the unjust man has demerits before God. So what does it mean to be just? And so according to Augustine, what he notices is that there actually is a hierarchy of goods in the world. Yes, our internal loves reflect a certain hierarchy. If I elevate ease over exercise, I've created an internal hierarchy of loves. But Augustine recognized that out there in the world, there actually are real hierarchies of goods. So man actually is having, reason and free will and being in the image of God actually is superior to the animals. Animals being sentient and capable of, self-propulsion and things like that are actually superior to plants. And so this is the notion of the great chain of being that we've talked about before on this podcast. The idea that there actually is a hierarchy of perfections or a hierarchy of goods in the world. And so according to Augustine, what he looks at is he says, well, the just man would render to each what is due, because that's what the word justitia in Latin means, right? You render to each its due. And so if there actually are certain hierarchies in the world, hierarchies of goods, what that means is that there are certain goods that you ought to love more than other goods. You ought to love man more than you love animals. You ought to regard animals more than you regard plants, and so on. And so what Augustine suggests is that the just man is a man whose affections or loves are properly ordered. They reflect the hierarchy of goods in the world. And of course, they reflect love of God above all other things, above all creatures. That would be just, because what it would mean is that your inner affections are rendering to each one their appropriate due. For each good, you're loving it proportionate to its goodness. Whereas if you start to love something that's lower in the chain, you elevate it more than it should. You treat it as a greater good than it should. You treat it, let's say, as a god, and, hedonism, right? Sex, food, something like that becomes basically the pinnacle of human experience. You've engaged in an unjust activity where you've made this thing into a god, and it's not worthy of that degree of affection. That would be unjust. And so Augustine's understanding of merits and demerits is that your deeds are not just, judged based on whether or not they cohere with the law, right? Did you not commit adultery? Did you not steal? Something like that. But by the inner order of loves, right? Because I've used this analogy before, right? You could have two people, both of whom are approached by someone who is soliciting some sort of adulterous relationship, and both of them reject it. But as Augustine points out, one person could do that out of something like fear, and another person could do it out of something like, love of God. And in this sense, the two acts, though externally identical, internally are different, right? One is driven or motivated by love of God, and in this sense may reflect a properly ordered set of loves and be meritorious before God, whereas the other one might have disordered sets of loves. It's, love of self that is the elevated thing, and there's some sort of self-preservation in the act of retreating from it. And in this sense, it's not really, it coheres with the law, but it's not a sort of righteous act. And in this sense, it has no merit. And so this is the basis on which you start to get this concept that suggests that the inner character of loves ends up determining whether a person's deeds are meritorious before God or whether they have demerit before God. Now, before the Pelagian dispute, which was such a definitive thing in shaping Augustine's thought on grace and on free will and on salvation, and then ultimately from Augustine shaped medieval thought and Protestant thought, both Catholic and Protestant thought. Essentially, before the Pelagian dispute, Augustine was of the mind that, well, if I look inside and I find that I have disordered loves, well, what do? I will to fix it and just start choosing differently, right? And he sort of treated the order of loves like it was something that was within your power to correct, by your own might, so to speak. But during the Pelagian dispute, where the real question became, well, what does it mean that salvation is by grace? And how is it by grace if I'm just sort of exerting my own will in order to produce properly ordered loves and do meritorious deeds? And this is where Augustine's position begins to shift into the position that ultimately became normative, not only for the medievals, but also for the Roman Catholic Church generally. It's still the Catholic view. But the basic idea that Augustine suggested here was that due to original sin, one of the things that we experience as part of the human condition is that we have disordered loves, and that's not in our power to fix it. So we can decide, commit adultery, not commit adultery, steal, not steal, murder, not murder. That is within our power. But what we can't do is we can't fix the internal character of the act, which determines whether or not it's meritorious before God. And according to Augustine, we, being bound by original sin, just have disordered love. So even when we obey the law, it still has no merit before God. It's still sin. And so if you've ever heard the notion of, total depravity, the idea that we sin of necessity, this is what that means. It doesn't mean that you necessarily commit murder, but what it means is whenever you do things that are good, somehow those goods are still tainted because you have these disordered loves due to original sin. And so what Augustine ultimately suggests is that the only way to to fix that is for God to, intervene and provide what, in Trent would be called, the Council of Trent would be called prevenient grace, right? And this is the notion that what happens is that the Holy Spirit, God, ultimately fixes your order of loves, making it possible for you to do things out of a pure love for God, making it possible for you to produce deeds, do good works, out of a pure love for God that for that reason would then, actually have merit before God. And so if you've ever heard it said, this is something that gets batted back and forth between Catholics and Protestants a lot. A lot of Protestants will characterize Catholics by saying, well, you have to earn your salvation, or your salvation is by your own works or by your own effort. And the Catholics will always respond that, no, they do think that salvation is by grace. Now, the question is, well, what's the disconnect there? Well, the disconnect there is that the Catholics are suggesting what Augustine suggested, which is to say that, yes, you have to do good deeds and you have to do good deeds that earn merits before God. But the only reason you're capable of doing a deed that would have merit before God is because of this grace that's been provided by God in the first place. So you're sort of doing it within this condition of grace. And that's the only reason that the deed has any merit before God. And so in this sense, that's why the Catholics want to say that, yes, works are necessary. You have to do things, right? You have to do things that have merit before God. But the only reason you can do things that have merit before God is because of this prior grace that's been given to you, you operating within a state of grace. And so as Augustine puts it, right, God is just rewarding what he's put back into you in the first place. But of course, with the Catholic position, with Augustine's position, what you end up having is ultimately the view that suggests that it is possible for you to cast off that grace. And so you can choose to say, well, even though I have this grace, even though I'd be capable of doing something pleasing to God, I'm not going to, and I'm going to rebel, and I'm going to sin, and I can cast it off. And so that becomes the dynamic that starts to play out within the Augustinian paradigm. The idea that you actually do have merits and demerits, demerits being these sort of unjust deeds that you accumulate, and then merits being the sort of thing that are produced when you operate from a proper set of loves, which is only possible when that grace is provided by God so that you can operate in accord with grace, synergistically, so to speak. Now, one of the things that also begins to develop over time and in the medieval period is the notion that certain merits might be transferable, right? So you not only have this sort of accounting that's taking place where you have merits and you have demerits, but you have this notion of transference of merits from one person to another. And this actually becomes the basis for things like indulgences. Right? So if you've ever thought it was really weird, if you've ever heard about indulgences, obviously when you hear the story about the Protestant Reformation, typically the place where most folks begin in telling that story, that historical story, is to talk about indulgences and the idea that essentially what was happening was that people were selling off merits, right? Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, and that somehow you could buy these indulgences in order to deliver people from purgatory or something like that, and that this is part of what sparks Luther's 95 Theses and so on and so forth. So if you've ever heard that, I mean, this is part of the basis of the notion of indulgences. The idea that there are certain saints, for example, who have produced more merits than is needed for their salvation. So there's this storehouse of merits, and it's within the power of the church with its binding and loosing capacities and so on to ultimately be able to transfer these merits. And so an indulgence, something like that, ultimately becomes something where there is the possibility of a transference of merits. Now, with that, one of the things that happens, even though you might look at that and balk, the notion doesn't go away within the Protestant context. And this is one of the reasons why I've talked about the fact that, with Protestantism, oftentimes Protestants and Catholics are closer in worldview than the Eastern Church Fathers, because ultimately, for the Eastern Christians, what you don't have these concepts of merits and demerits. You don't have this concept of transferable merits and this sort of thing. This type of accounting is, again, part of part of the thing that develops in the Latin West, and it sets the stage for the Protestant Reformation. And what you really see is that in the Protestant Reformation, there's not a rejection of the idea of merits and demerits. There's not a rejection of the idea of transferable merits. What's happening is actually a discussion between, the Reformers and the Catholics over, whose merits and how are they transferred. So within the Catholic context, what you ultimately have is we have these sort of demerits accumulating by virtue of doing things on our own power, doing things within original sin, performing unjust deeds. But what ultimately happens is with grace, with the support of grace, we're ultimately able to, sort of produce merits. But then there's also this possibility, of transferable merits. There's the possibility of absolution of demerits, right? Things like that. So then, within the Protestant Reformation, there's still an insistence on, there is an agreement that suggests like, well, yes, we are bound by original sin, and being bound by original sin, we have these disordered loves. And so there is a necessity of sin. There is a total depravity that tells us that our disordered loves ultimately are, have no merit before God. There's an insistence on that. But there's a rejection of the idea that even with the help of grace, even with some sort of support, right, divine support or aid being given to us, even when we start to grow and get better, we still have disordered loves, and for that reason, they still have no merit. So there's a rejection of that notion in Roman Catholicism. And ultimately, what starts to happen is the notion that, well, then how would you be saved, right? How does salvation come about? What is this righteousness that comes to us by grace? And ultimately, the Protestant answer is that it is a foreign righteousness. And here's where the transference of merits comes into play in the Protestant context, right? The idea here is ultimately that what happens is that what grace really does is, rather than fixing your order of love such that you can produce merits that are pleasing to God, what happens is the work of the Holy Spirit and the fixing of, the inner man allows you to have faith in God that is unto salvation. And here, just like in the Protestant or in the Catholic context with somebody like Augustine, where you had like the outer act versus the inner act, right? The outer act, you might be able to, in your own capacity, perform a good deed, but it wouldn't have merit because the inner act is distorted, and you need grace to fix the sort of inner act. So you have the same thing in the Protestant context, where there's a differentiation in somebody like Calvin, for example, between historical faith, which doesn't save, and the sort of genuine faith that does save, right? And so you have this outer and inner character, because Calvin wants to acknowledge that, it's possible that a person just by using, reason could be persuaded of the truth of Christianity, and in this sense have a historical belief, right, a historical faith, but it wouldn't be a saving faith. Saving faith is the sort of thing that requires that grace. And so here you have the same sort of resistance to any sort of Pelagian notion like you have in the Catholic context that would suggest that salvation could come about by my own effort. There's still a resistance to that in the Protestant context, but because salvation is now about faith rather than about works, the grace that needs to come in is a grace that comes in order to help you believe unto salvation. And so now the question becomes, well, but what of this righteousness, right? What is this righteousness that is from God that comes to us through faith? And the Protestant answer, this is ultimately going to be where the transference of merits comes in. The idea that by putting your faith in Jesus, the merits of Christ end up being transferred to your account. And now we reach the significance of this atonement, your demerits end up being transferred over to Christ on the cross. And so this is why this view of the cross becomes the centerpiece of the Christian gospel according to Protestantism, because ultimately what the gospel is a message that says, like, look, you're going to stand before a future judge. You are going to be condemned and punished, and rightly so, because you're a sinner and you violate his laws every day. And so the good news is that you can get off the hook. The good news is that your deeds, your demerits, can be transferred over to Christ and taken care of and paid for and have been paid for, and his merits can be transferred to you. And so even though you deserve punishment, you will be absolved and forgiven and be in good standing with God and receive heaven rather than hell. And that's ultimately the Christian gospel according to the Western Protestant notion. And so you can see why within the context of Protestantism that this would be the theory of atonement, right? It's the absolute centerpiece. Now, it wasn't necessarily the theory of the atonement in the Latin West. That's actually not true. So certain theories that we'll talk about, like the ransom theory here that we'll talk about momentarily, that are prominent in the Christian East, actually did exist in the Latin West. You can find, for example, the ransom theory in somebody like Augustine of Hippo. Now, Augustine's formulation of it is slightly different, as we'll talk about, but you do find that notion of the atonement there. You also find that even though this sort of satisfaction theory of the atonement, as it's sometimes called, or like in somebody like Anselm, where he formulates that, not everybody was on board with that. Abelard is not actually an advocate of it. And sometimes Abelard is mischaracterized as thinking that he just thinks Christ is a moral exemplar or something like that. That's not true. It's just that, Abelard doesn't systematize what the atonement does, right? He's convinced that Christ somehow delivers us from death and, bondage of the devil and things like that, but he doesn't really sort of systematically break down the mechanics of how that works the way somebody like Anselm does. And so the idea that somehow this was the singular way of approaching the understanding of the cross and what Christ accomplishes on behalf of humanity was not true in the Latin West. It's not true like for all of Latin history, but it does become really the centerpiece of the gospel within Protestantism, precisely because of the ways in which the Protestants understood the gospel as contrasted with the Roman Catholics. So now I suppose the question becomes, I presume this is the question being asked of me by people in the comments. The question becomes, well, how does this contrast with what we find in the Christian East? Do we find this in the Christian East? Do we not? And if we don't, what is it that we do find? Well, the fact of the matter is that we don't find just a single view of, the atonement or the understanding of what the cross of Christ accomplishes within the Eastern Fathers. Now, what I will say, the question becomes, well, so does that mean they disagree with each other and things like that? I think there's a difference between saying that there's no singular view and saying that there's no harmony or unity between the various views. And I think, as with a lot of things within the Eastern Church Fathers, you'll find that there are not these sort of strict dichotomies. I'll just give you an example. In John of Damascus's On the Orthodox Faith, which is a marvelous work, and I highly recommend it. If you're going to read just one thing from a church father, that would be the thing. But John of Damascus, that work, one of the reasons I love that work, and I think so many of the things that John of Damascus did are brilliant, not only because he's brilliant, but also because he has the foresight as a church father to try to do these sort of treatises that will say, well, what is the consensus of the fathers on a certain topic? And so what's so useful about it is, for example, like on the Fountain of Knowledge, he's giving you basically an encyclopedia of patristic terms. And so it's like an encyclopedia of patristic terms, church father terms, by a church father, right? A church father sitting here saying, well, when the church fathers use this word, this is what they mean. And on the Orthodox Faith is a similar sort of work where he's really clear, like I'm not looking to add anything unique of my own. And so he's offering up his understanding of what you find as the consensus of the fathers before him. And that's just an incredibly useful thing. But one of the things you'll see is that sometimes John will talk about certain areas where he'll say, well, some fathers say this and some fathers say that, and he doesn't give a single view. And one of these is that, for example, when he raises the question like, well, is the tree in Eden a real tree? Right. And he talks about, well, some people think yes. And then he's like, some people think it's an allegory for something else. And then he's like, but I don't see why it can't be both. And that's where you start to see that notion that sometimes the church fathers, the Eastern church fathers especially, are fine with things having, a certain literal meaning, and also having an allegorical meaning or spiritual meaning, being typological in some way or something like that. And so you don't find these sort of strict dichotomies where it just has to be one thing. It can be both of those things. It can be both allegorical and historical and literal, right? It can be both of those things at the same time. And so what's interesting is that when I look at the atonement, what I don't see in some of these things that we're going to talk about, I'll talk about the different sort of views of atonement, but what you don't see is saying, well, it's this and not that. Right. And I do think when you start to look at all the different things that are said by the Eastern Fathers, there is a harmony to all of these different sort of aspects of it. And so when I say there's not just one theory of atonement, what I mean is that they see what the work of Christ is and does. They see it as dynamic, such that there's not just one answer to what it accomplishes. So if we're going to talk about the spectrum of what it accomplishes, well, what is that? And where would we start? So let me start with actually just something on a biographical level. When I was first getting into the Eastern Church Fathers, and I was studying them as this wild-eyed heretical philosopher, one of the things that stood out to me really as a really notable thing about, Athenasius, for example, is that Athenasius on the Incarnation, it jumped out to me the fact that Athenasius begins, he understands the salvation of humanity, the restoration of humanity to begin with, not the atonement, but with the Incarnation itself, that somehow the Son of God becoming man ends up being in some ways therapeutic or healing for humanity. And that stood out to me because I was familiar with the developments of atonement within the Latin West. I was familiar with the centrality of the cross as this sort of crux of this, of this judicial predicament and rescue that's being executed on behalf of humanity within the sort of Latin way of thinking about the Christian narrative. And so I thought it was really remarkable that somehow the Annunciation, right, this moment where Christ is conceived, where the Son of God actually takes on flesh, is in some ways the beginning of the restoration and the healing of humanity. And that stood out to me. Now, I've talked about this before, where the idea is, and I talk about this at length. I think I talk about this at length, yes, in things like, for example, our series on the problem of evil, and then specifically where I talk about the meta-narrative of the Eastern Church Fathers. But let me just, so as to not rely entirely on that, let me go back to what I'd said at the start of this about the differences between the East and the West, and how I sort of in a very simplified way will sometimes sort of draw that distinction. And that distinction is the one that I said earlier, which is that the Latin West has a tendency to see Christianity as a judicial religion. God as a lawgiver, us as lawbreakers, the human condition being ultimately one having to do with future judgment and impending condemnation, and the gospel being some sort of judicial remedy, right? Some sort of absolution and setting right of our accounts before we reach the sort of dread judgment seat of Christ, so to speak. Whereas in the Eastern Fathers, if I were to very much simplify the contrast, what you really see there is you see that the human condition and the Christian narrative is entirely about life and death. The idea that we as human beings are created for a certain mode of life that can only come by partaking of God, that God himself is the source of life. He is the one who brings forth and articulates himself in all of these different goods that are the world. He is the source of life that we are supposed to imbibe and partake of and thrive in. And so the sort of life that we are made for is something that happens only by communion with God and actual participation or partaking of God himself. And so for that reason, it's just as a principle of physics, right? It's not vindictive. It's not, divine anger or, spite or something like that. It's a principle of physics that if, a creature turns away from the source of life, that creature begins to die. And so the human condition is ultimately a condition that says that in Eden, our species turns away from God, the source of life, the fount of life that we're supposed to imbibe in order to attain the sort of life that we are made to have. And by turning away from that, we move into a state of death and of dying. And that ultimately what the Incarnation is this point at which he who has life in himself, the very source of life that we've cut ourselves off from, enters our species in order to bring that life back to humanity and begin to heal us and restore us and unite us back to himself in his own person, and then open that up to us through his church, which becomes the hospital by which we begin to experience that healing and that restoration ourselves on a personal level. And for that reason, one of the things that you see throughout the Eastern understanding, the Eastern Church Fathers, about the Incarnation is this notion that Christ, as he enters into things, he begins to heal those things. The Incarnation is the start of that. You definitely see that, right? Christ takes on our nature, and taking on our fallen, corrupted, dying, twisted nature, he begins to heal it, right? By taking it on, he heals our will, he heals our mind. And this is one of the reasons why in all the Christological disputes, where people are asking, well, when the Son of God took on humanity, did he take on a human mind and a human will and human energies and things like that? And oftentimes heretics wanted to say no as a fancy way of trying to put God and man together. People like Apollinaris trying to remove the human mind in order to make the divine mind the sort of thing that fills in that gap or something like that. But the councils and the church fathers had always insisted, they always knew, they're like, no, the entire point of the Incarnation is that he enters our species in order to heal that species. And so unless you have unless he takes on the human mind isn't healed. Unless he takes on the human will isn't healed. And so ultimately, the Incarnation is about that healing, that union with us. And I've talked about this before, the idea that a mediator in the sort of Greek context is not one who stands between, like, talk to my attorney, don't talk to me, but is somebody who brings near or unifies, right? In some ways, I've oftentimes used this branding iron analogy, right, where the iron ends up being put in fire until it's inflamed and glowing, and you bring it over to the cow. And in this sense, it's a mediator. The branding iron is a mediator of the fire. The cow is really being burned by the fire because the iron is carrying the fire within it, the energies of the fire within it, and bringing it near to the cow. And this is how somebody like John Chrysostom understands when Paul says that there's one mediator between God and man. He understands this to be what's happening in the Incarnation. In the Incarnation, the Son of God, who is of the same nature of the Father and has the life of God within him, unites himself to our species, and in uniting himself to our species, he again becomes the mediator between God and man, reunifying that connection and bringing life to our species and healing it from the inside. Now, the reason I bring that up is because that becomes a pattern not only in the life of Christ, but also in some of the things that we begin to see in the crucifixion itself. And so, for example, just before we get to the crucifixion, I've pointed out that, throughout the Old Testament, you see these patterns where, when something that is clean comes in something that is unclean, then the thing that is clean actually becomes unclean and needs to be purified in order to be set right. Whereas what happens in the life of Christ, what ends up happening is all of that is inverted, right? He is the one who is clean, and he makes the unclean clean. So when touching a leper, for example, rather than being made unclean, the leper himself actually is made clean and healed, right? In his baptism, this is the understanding of things like of holy water. This is where that concept comes from. You and I enter waters in order to be purified, but Christ enters those waters in order to purify those. The waters were oftentimes associated with demonic powers, right? And so he enters the waters and he crushes the head of Leviathan. These are the sorts of things said in like the baptismal liturgies, for example. And he purifies those. He makes them holy. So rather than the waters making him holy, right, he's making the waters holy. And you see this again and again throughout the life of Christ, that whenever he approaches things, whether he enters these things, he makes them clean. Now, what's interesting is that one of the things you start to see, for example, if you read Athenasius, he talks about casting down or clearing the air. I've always wondered, I don't know for sure, but I wondered what the sort of original use, like where this first appears, right? Like, let's clear the air. That phrase, if you're familiar with it, but Athanasius uses that in a theological context. And so I've always been curious if it's in some ways traceable to that. I don't actually know. But nonetheless, what Athanasius means is that he points out that we are within this demonic dominion. And this is a critical feature of how the Eastern Church Fathers understand our condition. Again, see my series on the problem of evil. But the idea that we have in some ways subjugated subjugated ourselves to the demonic powers of this world. So we live in a world that, again, as I've talked about in other episodes, consists of hierarchies. And part of these hierarchies that are there within the cosmos include angelic hierarchies, celestial hierarchies. And those celestial hierarchies have been entrusted with the care of, various aspects of the cosmos. The elements, with nations, with individuals, with, the care of animals and animal birth and things like that. I talk about all of that in the series on the problem of evil when I talk about the Eastern patristic narrative. And of course, if you're familiar with the Christian narrative, many of those powers rebelled, right? And this is where St. Paul talks about the devil as the god of this world, right? So you have these sort of demonic powers that are reigning within this world. And what you have is you have the possibility of Adam and Eve, were they actually to unite themselves to God and, actually become what they were made to become, they could actually begin the healing of the cosmos from within. They would be that point to begin to undo the corruption that had entered the world. But instead, what happens is those same demonic powers end up trying to corrupt humanity. And in successfully corrupting humanity, we get dragged into that corruption that's already there, and we become part of the sick and dying cosmos. And for that reason, we ultimately subjugate ourselves to the demonic powers rather than elevating above them. And so that's a critical feature of how, sort of the narrative of Christianity is understood. Well, what's happening with Christ? So when you have Christ, this second Adam, who actually is going through and is undoing the corruption of the world and retaking dominion of it through humanity, what you begin to see is exactly what I talked about, that he, as he enters our corrupt and dying species, he brings life to it. As he touches the unclean, he makes them clean. When he enters things like the chaotic waters, he purifies them and he makes them holy. And so this notion also appears in Athenasius with regard to the air. When he's lifted up, meaning into the air, the demons who dwell in the air are cast down. That's one of the things that you actually see. So the purification that's happening by Christ, where he enters into humanity, he enters into the waters, he enters into the air, he ultimately enters into death. You can see the whole series on the harrowing of Hades. I have a letter on that, and we've posted that here in the past, and I've talked about that in other contexts. He even enters the realm of the dead, and rather than being sort of held captive by death, he ends up bringing life to the dead. This is one of the things that happens again and again and again within this aspect of the Eastern patristic narrative. The idea that Christ has life in himself. He is incorruptible. He is immortal. He has the life of God within him. And as he enters into the things of the cosmos that are broken and twisted and dying and demonic, he ends up dispelling that darkness and bringing life to those dead and dying organs within the cosmos. And this actually includes in the cross him being lifted up into the air and casting down the demonic powers. So if you actually pay attention to a number of different like hymnody and things like that, you'll hear this language in different aspects of Eastern liturgical texts where they talk about the demons are cast down, and that does seem to be tied with what Athanasius is talking about, that the demons dwell in the air. And this was just related to the understanding that they're celestial, right? So we are terrestrial beings, we dwell on earth. They are aerial spirits, meaning they dwell in the air. You find that in the Eastern Church Fathers, you find it in the liturgical text. And so what Athanasius is talking about is that when Christ is lifted up on the cross, he enters basically the aerial realm, so to speak, and casts down the demons. That's one of the aspects you find. Another thing that you end up finding here is actually the ransom theory. And this is probably one of the ones that I think most people, if they know anything about Eastern views of the atonement, is popularized largely probably because of C.S. Lewis, right? That the idea that C.S. Lewis, at least in the Narnia Chronicles, offers a picture of a ransom theory. Now, in Mere Christianity, he doesn't actually do that. When he's talking about the atonement in Mere Christianity, he actually offers this other notion that we'll talk about, and where he talks about God repenting in humanity on behalf of humanity. But in Mere Christianity, obviously, you have this sort of picture of Aslan giving himself up, to the White Witch in order to get Edmund off the hook, and then he's killed. And then by being killed, this ends up undoing, as it were, the sort of the power of the White Witch and so on. And so a lot of people have recognized that, well, that's an awful lot like the ransom theory within the church fathers, where humanity is held captive by the devil, and Christ ransoms us from the devil in some ways. So let's talk about the ransom theory a little bit, which is another one that, now this one is one, as I said, it appears not just in the Christian East, right? It's there in people like Gregory of Nyssa, but it's also there in people like Augustine. And so when we look at somebody like Augustine, like Augustine's formulation is different than what we get in somebody like Gregory. Augustine's formulation is that what he essentially talks about is he talks about the idea that the devil is the one who has the power of death. Here, of course, hearkening to Hebrews, right? He who has the power of death, which is the devil. And so Augustine suggests that the devil occupies this place of being a mediator of death to the world, and that because we've subjugated ourselves to the devil and to his dominion, the devil can justly and rightly, within in keeping with his sort of sphere of sovereignty, so to speak, minister death to humanity. He talks about this in De Trinitate, I think it is, and yet what he talks about is that because Christ is righteous and is not due death, that when the devil ultimately, sort of tries to administer death to Christ, that what happens is that he oversteps his boundary line in terms of his appropriate dominion, and for this reason is rightly ripped. His authority to administer death is taken from him, and now God can administer life to humanity, having sort of dethroned the devil as the administrator of death, because he has exercised that unjustly and is rightly stripped of that power. That's kind of how Augustine characterizes it. But in the Christian East, and somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, it has a very different sort of tone and character to it. And it's much more in keeping with some of the patterns that I talked about before just a moment ago, having to do with like life and death. So part of what Gregory talks about in his Great Catechism, for example, is, if you want to go see where he says it's in there, he talks about this idea that Christ, is veiled, right? The Son of God, who he is, his divinity ends up being veiled in flesh. And that might be weird to people, right? Because they might look at this and go like, what do you mean? Like, didn't the devils already know that, he's the Son of God and so on? Well, within, and if you've listened to me talk about, the Mary narrative, we've done a couple of different episodes on Mary. I think it's primarily in, Mary Grinch Slayer, that one, that episode, you could find this, what I'm about to talk about at greater length. But within the Eastern Church Fathers, it's pretty consistent that one of the things about the virgin birth is that the virgin birth was, at least in part, a ruse in order to hide the incarnation from the devil. So it's rather interesting, right? This is an aspect of the narrative that you find there, where basically the presumption is that the devil is watching the virgins, the maidens of Israel. He's aware of the prophecies. He's looking to see if there's going to be a virgin that conceives. And so for that reason, he's sort of monitoring the maidens of Israel. And that's why Mary is actually entrusted to Joseph in the first place. And within tradition, ultimately, Joseph is already a widower. He's much older. She's very young. Joseph's even scandalized by this. Like, she's a freaking kid. Are you kidding me? I'm supposed to marry this chick? And they're like, well, look, when an archangel tells you to hand this girl over to somebody, that's what you do. And so ultimately what you see within that story is how it's understood by the church fathers is that this is, again, part of the protection of the incarnate Son of God from the devil, just like you see within the gospel accounts, where they're warned in dreams that, like, hey, somebody's going to come and try to kill this infant. You got to flee, right? Okay, the people who were after the child, are dead. You can go back now. And they see that same sort of line of reasoning, that same sort of thing plays out in their understanding of why you would give a virgin who's supposed to become a mother over to a husband, right? And that's where they understand that to be a ruse, right? To in some ways hide her and the child particularly from the devil. Now, so in keeping with that, it's no surprise then that Gregory of Nyssa, when he starts to talk about the ransom theory, he starts to talk in a way where it's almost like the devil slowly starts to realize who this really is. And so as Gregory tells the story, what you start to see is the idea that as Christ begins to show forth his divinity, right, it begins to manifest in these operations, these operative powers of, healing people, of casting out demons, right, of restoring the unclean and purifying the waters and things like that. As these things are starting to happen, this is sort of these glimmers of divinity are breaking forth, and the devil is putting together the pieces. I recognize what's going on here, and that ultimately, the way Gregory tells this, right, is that this unveiling with this sort of slow flickering of divinity coming out is much like the way, a fish is drawn to a hook. And so the idea here is that what Gregory wants to suggest is that what the devil doesn't know is that if he actually does kill Christ and bring him into Hades, that this will be his undoing. But he just can't resist, right? He can't resist because he's being enticed. So here what's happening is that the slow unveiling of the divinity is meant to entice the devil, that the devil looks at this and goes, this is my chance to actually try to kill God, right? To kill the Son of God. And so he can't resist. And ultimately, this is why he begins to orchestrate the crucifixion of Christ. Now here, we reach the point where, in what way does this ransom humanity from the devil? And you see this come through in a few different things. Like one of the passages that a lot of the Eastern church fathers and Eastern writers generally, like Origen, point out is the passage where Christ talks about binding the strong man and ransacking his house, right? So Christ talks about how you can't sort of ransack a guy's house unless you first bind him, right? You've got to bind him in order to steal his stuff. And so the way this is actually understood is that the strong man is the devil, and Hades, where humanity's held captive by death because of him, and his, and the demonic powers that dragged us into corruption. That is his house, right? So we are held captive by the devil, by death and the devil, within the house that is the realm of the dead, death, Hades, and the devil has dominion over us. We've subjected ourselves to him. And ultimately what he's suggesting is that by Christ dying and entering into the realm of the dead, what happens is that rather than death being ministered to Christ, the inverse happens. He who is incorruptible, immortal, who has life in himself, he cannot experience death. He cannot be made to die because it would be a privation, an absence, an undoing of something that is essential to him, indispensable to him. So when he enters the realm of the dead, what happens is he actually brings life and light to it. Just like when he enters the waters, he makes them holy. Just like when he touches the unclean, he can't be made unclean. He makes them clean. And so when he enters the realm of the dead, he brings life even there. And that's one of the reasons why when entering that place, life spreads to all of the human species, and he ransacks the devil's house. And so by embracing his impending death, which is the will of the Father, but is going to be mediated to him by the devil, and his orchestration, entering Judas, all of that sort of stuff, what happens is that Christ brings life even to things like death, into the realm of the dead, ministering life and restoring those things back to health and wholeness, bringing them back to God and undoing the cancer within the cosmos even there. So that's a second aspect that you start to see. Now, again, I don't think any of these things are actually at odds with each other. I think it's perfectly compatible to say what Athenasius says about the clearing of the air and the casting down of the demonic powers, as well as the entering into Hades and administering life to the dead there, and so on and so forth. There's also another aspect, which again is tied in with this narrative of the healing and restoration of humanity. You see this in somebody like Maximus the Confessor. And here you find something that is rather dicey. And I'm going to say it's rather dicey because I don't know how many people actually really talk about this aspect of East-West divide. But what I'll say is this. Within the Latin West, one of the things that you see is you really do see Christ as almost a complete reset. And this is the sort of thing that comes through in things like the Immaculate Conception, which actually isn't Catholic dogma until like the 19th century. And before that, you actually do have significant Catholic thinkers, obviously, like Thomas Aquinas, who don't hold to it. But ultimately, this is the concept that suggests that Mary is preserved from original sin. And being preserved from original sin, we have this sort of clean vessel into which the Son of God enters. And now with original sin, you actually do have both the stain of Adam's sin, right? So there's some sort of transference that is communicated, as well as you also have the distorted order of loves, right? That creates that necessity of sin. And so that becomes the sort of baseline human condition. And so, of course, when it comes to Christ, if you're going to suggest that Christ is going to, in some ways, offer up some sort of sacrifice along the lines of what we've talked about in terms of the Latin view of what the atonement actually accomplishes, then you're going to need him to be without spot and blemish. And of course, this means he's going to have to be insulated from original sin. So whether it's because he doesn't inherit it through Mary because, as Aquinas says, the formal, properties, the form, the nature, is transferred through the Father. That's Aquinas' view. And so the Immaculate Conception becomes sort of irrelevant, right? The mother is only contributing the matter, is what Aquinas says. He has a hylomorphic form matter view. So the Father contributes the nature, and as long as that's pure, then the person doesn't have original sin. And since Christ doesn't have a human father, all is well, right? So you could say that. So one way or another, you need to ultimately preserve Christ from the stain of original sin. So you can do that in one of two ways. You can either suggest that something like the Immaculate Conception, where there is this sort of insulation of original sin that happens with Mary, and then this pure vessel is the one that the new Adam enters into. Or you could do it the way Aquinas does. He has a hylomorphic view where you and I are form matters composites, and the form is the nature of the essence. And when we're talking about corrupt man, that's in the form. And so the fact that Christ doesn't have a human father, that means he's protected from original sin. And so that's where you get this sort of reset that happens there. But what's interesting is that from what I can tell, looking at the Eastern Church Fathers, this is definitely not their view, because first of all, metaphysically, there's an insistence that you and I share a common nature. Like you can see this, for example, in Gregory of Nyssa's letter to Ablabius. He's actually talking about the Trinity, but one of the things that becomes really clear is that he thinks that you and I have one nature. Our nature is truly common. And so, for example, he's using this metaphor for the Trinity, this analogy for the Trinity, where he talks about, three human persons, Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus. And those are three hypostases, three subjects, and they share a common nature, human. And in the context of using that analogy, one of the things that he ends up asking is he asks, well, does that mean that we have three gods? Now, again, my point here is not about the Trinity, so stay focused on the point we're making about metaphysics. He suggests that the question is set up because basically Ablabius is asking, like, well, I would say those are three humans, so do we believe in three gods? And Gregory of Nyssa's answer is like, no, we don't, because what you just said there, Ablabius, is a common abuse of language. And what he means is that when you're talking about human, when you're using a species term, that actually is singular. There is only one human nature. And so what he suggests is that even though we talk this way and we say, yeah, there's three humans, he actually suggests that that is imprecise and a common abuse of language because there are not multiple species of thing there. There are not multiple essences, multiple species, multiple forms. There's only one nature, human. And so what he suggests is the more precise way you would say it is that there are three human singular persons, right, or subjects, whichever way you want to translate hypostasis. I'd prefer subject. But anyway, but the point is to suggest that what Gregory believes is that you and I share one nature, human. Now, the reason that's important is because if Christ is going to take on humanity and heal humanity, he has to take on our nature. There's only one of them. If he takes on a different nature, then he's something other than human, right? He's human asterisk, second different species. And so if he's going to take on humanity, he has to take on our species. And so for that reason, what you actually see is rather than this sort of like reboot that happens where like we get a new human or something like that, the language is ultimately that Christ enters our fallen species, our fallen nature, and he takes it on and he heals it. Now, granted, the entering is the healing. You look at John of Damascus's like homilies on Mary, it's really clear on the Theotokos. He does several homilies on the Theotokos. If you look at those, it's really clear that, that this language is that Christ, takes on our humanity. And it does seem that the language means that there's an instantaneous healing of the will. For example, there's no point at which Christ's will is in any ways, subject to, the corruptions of sin. But there is this talk of him, even though he takes on our nature and he heals it, right? He sets it back right. There is with that this taking on of what are called the blameless passions. And so there's a distinction between those passions for which we are blameworthy and those passions that are natural and are not blameworthy, right? And so what the insistence is that even though Christ takes on humanity and heals it and restores it, it's still restored and healed humanity still has to undergo this sort of a development toward deification or theosis. And so if you think back actually on the series where I talked about the Eastern patristic meta-narrative in the series on the problem of evil, one of the things that I've talked about there and elsewhere is that Eden is not, the sort of picture of what humanity is made to become, right? Adam and Eve are made in a state, created in a state where, yes, they are free of sin. Yes, they are not corrupt, but they clearly haven't yet become incorruptible or immortal, evident in the fact that they become corrupted and they die, right? So clearly they haven't yet attained what they are made to be. They're in a better state than we are, right? Because we're corrupt and they are not corrupt, but they are not yet incorrupt, immortal, partakers of the divine nature, the way humanity is made to be. And this goes to the distinction that I've mentioned before in the Eastern Church Fathers between the image and likeness of God. In Genesis, God says, let us make man in our own image according to our own likeness. He makes man in his own image, and likeness is not repeated. And as I've pointed out, that the Eastern Church Fathers, people like Basil of Caesarea, in one of his homilies on discourse on man being made in the image and likeness of God, I think is what it's called. And then there's also Irenaeus against heresies. He talks about this. But, the idea being that the image is that baseline nature, the fact that we are rational, that we have free will, that we have this capacity to behold and partake of God and participate in God. That nature is there. That's the image part. But the likeness is actually, it requires free will. It requires active participation. It is that by which we move toward God and we actively begin to imitate God. And in imitating God, we partake of the divine nature. And so certain things like justice, like virtue, like love, those sorts of things are active, operations. And so that's why there's a need for man to, in some ways, participate in his own creation, that we are created at this baseline capacity to become something more, but we actually have to enter into that freely and actively cooperating with that in order to become something more, in order to partake of the divine nature. And ultimately, we know that Adam and Eve didn't. They retreated from that, right? And they dragged our species down into corruption and so on. And so what you see is that what you have in the Incarnation is that, yes, the Incarnation, by entering into humanity is set right and healed. But what you also see is within the Eastern Church Fathers this idea of still a progression beyond that. Just as Adam was in an uncorrupted state, but needed to progress toward deification. So what happens is with the Son of God, even though in entering our species, he heals it and he restores it, there is still a carrying forth of making humanity into what we were made to be. And you see this in a couple of ways. There's a real sense in which resurrection itself, and we don't even need to appeal to the Eastern Church Fathers here. We could appeal to St. Paul in order to make this point. Resurrection is not just reanimation. And this is actually something I've talked about in the past. That was something that I had studied before I was aware of the Eastern Church Fathers, and it struck me as a very odd thing. When I was studying the New Testament, there were certain things that I was studying the New Testament on resurrection, things like that. I was also studying pagan philosophers on death, on reincarnation, things like that. And so the New Testament and the Old Testament were part of that study I was doing on ancient views of death and the afterlife and things like that. And when I was doing that, I noticed this really odd thing where on the one hand, you had these statements in Paul about Christ being raised from the dead, can't die again. And yet at the same time, I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because surely like Lazarus died again. So what, this seems to be obviously fallacious, right? The claim that somehow having been raised from the dead, you can't die again. I mean, that's obviously false. We reanimate people all the time. They die and we bring them back and they still die again, right? So like, what is Paul talking about? And as I studied the New Testament, what I started to realize is that there was a distinction in St. Paul between reanimation or the raising of somebody like Lazarus and resurrection. Because when Paul talks about resurrection, like in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, what he's clearly talking about is something that is a metamorphosis, right? This is not just your heart stopped and we restarted it. This is not just that you died and you were brought back in the same condition you were before. This is a transformation of some kind. So when Paul talks about this, he talks about the putting off of corruption for incorruption, being buried one way and raised another way. He's talking about different types of glory and things like that. So Paul is clearly talking about some sort of metamorphosis. And if we cross list that, if we check that with what St. Peter has to say, Peter says that, we escape corruption, which is what Paul's talking about, putting off corruption for incorruption. We escape corruption by partaking in the divine nature. And so what I started to realize is, resurrection, right? Like resurrection is something categorically different than just reanimation. That's why Paul can say that he hopes to attain to the resurrection from the dead. Well, why? Because not all raising is the resurrection from the dead. That's a very specific transformation that takes place. That is not just any reanimation. And that's also why if you look at ancient icons, if you look at, icons of Lazarus, those which have writing on them, right, like in Greek and things like that, that label what the icon is, it's always the raising of Lazarus. It's not the resurrection of Lazarus, because Lazarus wasn't resurrected. Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection from the dead. Now I say that because when you look at this, what you see is that metamorphosis, that is what man is made for, right? The full putting off of corruption for incorruption, the, attaining of immortality is something that happens at the resurrection from the dead. Christ reaches that pinnacle, right? He transforms humanity into what we are made to be at the resurrection from the dead, not before. So what you see that there is a healing of humanity that takes place in the incarnation itself, but there's still an ushering toward what ultimately we're made to be, which doesn't happen until the resurrection itself. That's where we first see Christ successfully making man into what we were made to be. Now, I say all of this because this provides context for something that Maximus the Confessor talks about that wouldn't otherwise make any sense. So Maximus the Confessor, he talks about the crucifixion as the final defeat of the passions. Now, again, this is sort of really weird if you don't have, think of Christology and the Incarnation the way the Eastern Church Fathers do. But one of the things that Maximus talks about, right, is the fact that we recognize with Christ that Christ is really human, right? He does take on humanity. And because the passions The passions are not a product of sin. The disordered state where the passions have an unnatural sway over, reason and will, the sort of thing Paul talks about in Romans 7, that's a product of the fall. But the existence of the passions is not. That is part of our nature. And that's why they talk about the blameless passions. And so what the passions are, just in case you're unfamiliar with this term, sort of a simple way of thinking about it is that they're just animal responses to external stimuli. You encounter something and it strikes you as good, or it strikes you as contrary to the good, right? And so if it strikes you as good, it has a certain pull that is before your will, right? And, it's just sort of reflexively, it pulls you in. You smell pizza and that's good. And all of a sudden you want it, right? You see someone who's very attractive and you're pulled in, right? That sort of attraction, something like that. And so you have that. There's also then the reflexive recoiling, right? When it seems to be to your detriment, when it seems to threaten your life, right? You suddenly see, you see something out of the corner of your eye and you think it looks like somebody standing there who might be threatening in some ways, and your body recoils, right? You reflex back. You see somebody or something that seems to be in danger. You nearly step off a ledge and you stop yourself, and your body recoils, right? This is where there's a threat to your good and the body recoils. So the passions have to do with this sort of like leaning toward or pulling away, this inclining toward or recoiling in response to this external, stimuli, this perception. And so this is one of the reasons why the passions, that's not a sinful thing, right? That's there. But what is unnatural in our experience is that the passions have an unnatural sway over us. And this is what St. Paul talks about, where rather than those being governed and set in order by the higher rational nature, they have the ability to, sort of basically intoxicate us and, sort of pull us toward actions that then later when we're sober, we're like, man, what was I thinking? And we do things we don't want to do. And we don't do things that we do want to do. And we're wretched people, right? Like that sort of thing that Paul says, that's the passions, the distorted state in which we find ourselves. And so what you see in Christ is that even though Christ heals human nature by taking it on, he still has the blameless passions. The Eastern Fathers say that explicitly. And yet there is this need to sort of put the passions back in order. This explains how Christ could feel temptation, right? Because there is nothing sinful about the idea of the passions responding to things. This is how Cyril of Alexandria, for example, when he talks about Christ being grieved, right, about his impending death, right? He knows his martyrdom is coming. You see that, right? Those are the passions that recoil away from death. Clearly, when Christ is sweating blood in Gethsemane, those are the blameless passions, right? The passions appropriately don't want to die. And so he feels those sorts of things. But ultimately, in engaging in a definitive act that orders the person rightly toward God, no matter what, from the passions, this is where the crucifixion plays that pivotal role. And so what you see in Maximus the Confessor is he talks about crucifixion being that definitive act of the final defeat of the passions and the rightly ordering of man. Well, why? Well, because every passion at its root is basically saying, give me that or I'll die, right? Or take that away from me or I'll die. And of course, the take it away from me, the ultimate thing is really death. And so by embracing death and martyrdom in keeping with the will of God, right, in service to God, in obedience to God, this becomes the definitive defeat of the passions. They have no more sway at that point. And so this is really the thing this is how Maximus the Confessor talks about this, right? The idea, or at least one of the ways he talks about this, he talks about the crucifixion and the embrace of martyrdom being the definitive defeat of the passions in the ordering of man, which again, makes sense if you understand Christology in this way, right? Where Christ heals our humanity by entering it, sets it right, but there's still that road toward progress and ultimately deification that is culminated in his martyrdom and the resurrection from the dead, where humanity, as we are made to be, is finally manifest on the earth for the first time ever, right? It wasn't Adam. It is Christ. The resurrected Christ is the first time you see the picture of humanity as we are made to be, having put off corruption for incorruption. So again, when you look at this, like, I don't see any conflict between what you find in people like Athenasius and people like you find like Gregory of Nyssa, and even this aspect of Maximus the Confessor. All of it fits into this consistent narrative having to do with the healing of the cosmos, the healing of humanity, the setting of things right back, to the way they are made to be, and ushering humanity forth to become the thing that we were originally created to be. And so that's ultimately, those are some of the themes that you see there when you look at the Eastern Church Fathers as contrasted with the sort of penal substitution or substitutionary atonement of the Latin West. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully that answers your question, or at least begins to answer your question and give you a glimpse into some of my thoughts on the atonement and what I see as some of the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West on this topic. So I suppose we'll end there for today. So with that, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.